Good afternoon, and welcome to Invest Precision Medicine. I'm Stephanie Baum, Director of Special Projects with MedCity News. I'm really excited about our panel discussion this afternoon. How can we improve health equity in precision medicine? Targeted therapies for certain types of cancer and rare disease offer hope for these patient populations, but how can we ensure that these treatments are also developed with minority communities in mind? So I'm excited about this panel discussion, and without further ado, let's introduce the speakers moderating our health equity panel this afternoon is Dr. Kemi Olugemo of Ionis Pharmaceuticals, where she is Executive Medical Director in Neurology Clinical Development. Over her more than 13 years in clinical research, Kemi has been involved in all phases of clinical development, global medical strategy, business development, and innovations in lifecycle planning. Prior to joining Ionis, Dr. Olugemo held progressive leadership roles at Axia Therapeutics, Parexel International, and Questcor Pharmaceuticals. Was a long-term consultant in neurology with Quorum Independent Review Board. Kemi draws on a diverse set of experiences, including the current Director of Communications at Women of Color in Pharma, board member at Watermark, and serving on the scientific committee of the International Society for CNS Clinical Trials and Methodology. Welcome to the panel, Kemi. Also on the panel, we have Dr. Kate Burke, who has 32 years of experience as an emergency medical physician at the Milford Regional Medical Center in Massachusetts. She serves as senior medical advisor with PatientsLikeMe. She's also the co-founder of a company called What Did the Doctor Say?, which was eventually acquired by PatientsLikeMe. And also that's when she began her role as senior medical advisor with PatientsLikeMe. PatientsLikeMe is the world's largest personalized health network and provides 24/7 support for patients to understand their risk factors and encourage them to get screened regularly. Dr. Burke currently teaches emergency medicine at the University of Massachusetts Medical School and is passionate about educating others in the field. Her core mission is to make healthcare inclusive for all and to elevate the patient voice. Welcome to the panel, Kate. Also on the panel, we have Elisabeth Heath, Dr. Elisabeth Heath, Associate Center Director, Translational Sciences Chair, Genitourinary Oncology Multidisciplinary Team with Karmanos and Cancer Institute. She also is the Associate Center Director of Translational Sciences and Hartman Endowed Chair for Prostate Cancer Research at the Barbara Ann Karmanos Cancer Institute, and Wayne State University School of Medicine. She's also Medical Director of the Infusion Center at Karmanos headquarters in Detroit. Additionally, she conducts clinical trials and translational research trials in genitourinary oncology. With a focus on eliminating health disparities, she increases awareness and accrual of minority patients to prostate cancer clinical trials. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Heath. And we also have patient advocate Alicia Merchant, who's the founder of Making Lupus Look Good. She's a chronic disease self-management workshop leader and a team of advisors member for the largest personalized healthcare network, PatientsLikeMe, and a virtual advisory board member for the All of Us Health Research Program with the National Institutes of Health. Her organization, Making Lupus Look Good, originated out of her life-changing diagnosis with an autoimmune illness at a young age. Despite her adversities, Alicia has attained many achievements due to her philanthropic ventures. She has been a keynote speaker for medical schools such as the Edward Via College of Osteopathic Medicine, and her experiences have given her a deep understanding of the diverse needs of families in the community. And without any further ado, I'll hand the panel over to you, Kemi.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for that kind introduction. My name is Kemi Olugemo. I am a neurologist who began my career seeing adult and pediatric patients with neurological problems. Over a decade ago, I transitioned to working in the pharmaceutical industry to join a host of people who are dedicated to finding treatment for serious diseases with high unmet need. In my current role at Ionis Pharmaceuticals, I work with teams to design and implement clinical development plans for patients with rare neurological diseases. In my daily work, our goal is to create the largest possible benefit for patients and to do so in an equitable way. Equity in healthcare means that there are no unfair or unjust differences in access and outcomes. With that said, the topic today is about improving equity in precision medicine, and we are very lucky to have a staunch patient advocate on our panel today, Alicia Merchant. Alicia, please tell us your story about living with lupus, what challenges you had, and what led you to create your organization called Making Lupus Look Good.
Sure, thank you. So, as mentioned, I'm Alicia Merchant. I'm 32 years old. In August of 2012, I woke up one morning feeling very exhausted, very fatigued and achy, almost as if I had the flu. But I brushed it off as working too hard because at the time I was going to school and I was working 2 jobs. I was a mother, a young mother. So, I just brushed it off as maybe just overworked and that was it. Needless to say, weeks went by and the fatigue worsened, body aches worsened. I started experiencing extreme headaches. I actually had to pull over one day on my way home from work because the fatigue and headaches were so excruciating. I was not going to make it home. And I pulled over into a Walmart parking lot and I slept for like hours. I went to the doctor several times. I was told that I was just, again, overworked. I needed to take vitamins. I needed to get more sleep, et cetera, which I knew wasn't the case because that's actually all I did was sleep. But I continued to push through. It wasn't until the physical manifestations started to appear, such as the skin rashes. I had the butterfly rash appear from on one cheek across the bridge of my nose to the other cheek. The hair loss came into play. I woke up one morning and realized that I had a bald patch in my hair, started to brush and it started coming out in clumps. Within a week's time, I was completely bald. And I would just lock myself in the bathroom and I would just cry for hours because at this point I was exhausted. I was tired. Felt horrible. I had no hair. I had skin rashes everywhere. And then I started experiencing fluid edema in my feet, legs, and abdomen, which became very painful. It wasn't until I was at work one day and I felt like I was actually going to pass out. I was slumped over at my desk. They called over the nurse on call in the building and she checked my temperature. It was like 104. And I remember telling them that my foot felt like it was going to explode. And they took my shoe off and it was huge. And I blacked out. And I woke up in the hospital and I had this amazing nephrologist that so happened to be on call. And he instantly knew what it was. He's like, I think you have lupus, and which I had never heard of it in my life, but he was like, let's run a couple of tests and just be sure. And everything came back positive, lupus nephritis, stage 3 chronic kidney disease. And from that moment on, my life just changed drastically. The first thing I tried to do was find something in my community or someone in my community that could tell me, hey, I've been through this, and if I can get through it, then you can too. But I was not successful in finding it. I did find a phone number and I called, and the number was disconnected. So it was very disheartening for me because I had to go through it alone. They immediately started me on the typical lupus treatments, which my body was not responding to. So a year went by with, still experiencing hair loss, still experiencing the fatigue, still experiencing the fluid all over my body. And it just was not responding. But I continued to go to work and try to push through. But I eventually went into acute kidney failure. And at that point, the doctors were like, the only option we have for you is chemotherapy. And so I did 6 months of that, in which I experienced a little more hair loss, and it was very rough. But it did put me on my path to recovery. And so from that moment forward, in 2014, I decided that I never wanted any woman that I came in contact with, or person for that matter, to ever go through what I went through alone. And so I started my nonprofit, Making Lupus Look Good, and we provide custom wigs for women who are experiencing hair loss and insecurities caused by lupus, and also photo shoots, just to restore the confidence that they may have lost due to disease itself. I then became a certified chronic disease self-management workshop leader, in which I lead workshops to help people with chronic diseases learn how to still live meaningful lives despite the battles that we face day in and day out. I started the first support group in my community, the Survivor Circle, in over 10 years for lupus patients. And so I just dived straight into advocacy, and I was doing really great. And I thought I had everything under control. And in 2016, everything went left again. And Woke up one morning, couldn't really see, had extreme headaches, which eventually led to like grand mal seizures and a diagnosis of pseudotumor. Started on treatments for that, which were, in my opinion, unsuccessful. I was still experiencing seizures all the time. I couldn't drive. I wasn't able to live at home by myself. I had to move back in with my mother. I just felt like I started over again. But I started to do my own research on pseudotumor. And I learned on my own that most people who had this illness were either A, overweight, or B, had high amounts of vitamin A in their system. I spoke with my doctor and I was neither one. I didn't fit the criteria for either one. And so I didn't get the answers that I needed from my doctor, but I still decided that I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So I reached out to my Patients Like Me community, and to other people that had pseudotumor. And I was like, hi, I'm Alicia. I have pseudotumor. And I'm having seizures. Do any of you guys, have any of you all had seizures before? And everyone was like, no, we haven't. So fast forward, I ended up getting a second opinion from Johns Hopkins. And because they had very few, but some cases of people who had lupus and pseudotumor, they were able to quickly figure out that I did have pseudotumor, but it only developed secondary to lupus. So the typical medicines were not going to work for me. They were able to get me on my path to recovery, but it really enlightened me to the fact that this thing is not a one size fits all scenario. Everybody's case is completely different. And so I just really at that point decided to get involved in healthcare research with Patients Like Me, which also led to the All of Us research program. But I learned in the process that there was such a lack of participation from the African American community in these studies, which was very, again, disheartening to me because lupus mostly affects African Americans or women of color. And so if we're not participating and we're not being counted in these studies, then we're never going to get the answers that we need. And so that's where I am now in my advocacy, not only bringing awareness to lupus, but also educating the African American community on the importance of us participating so that we can find cures for these diseases that are adversely affecting our communities. So.
Wow, that's such a powerful and inspiring story. Thank you for sharing that, Alicia. I'm getting the sense that your resilience and your network and becoming an advocate yourself is a large part of why you are at the place that you are today. And you mentioned being involved with Patients Like Me, and we have Dr. Kate Burke here on the panel. Kate, I'm just interested in hearing from you more about the integrated platform that Patients Like Me has, as well as the work that you're doing with other advocacy groups.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kemi. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. And of course, thank you to MedVest for inviting myself and Alicia to the conversation about how we can improve health equity and precision medicine. My training and background, as you heard, happens to be in emergency medicine, and I practiced for more than 3 decades. And in my life, no matter where whomever I saw, they knew that the ED was accessed 24/7, and I essentially have deep gratitude for having worked in a specialty for a long time where there was a mandate to take care of people, because obviously this is very important when we're thinking about health equity. And one of the reasons I joined Patients Like Me was the fact that essentially Patients Like Me is a digital home, a home, for example, that Alicia found for all patients and people that have different conditions and caregivers of people to enter with any kind of diagnosis or problems. And we on Patients Like Me, what our platform allows is people sign up and, like Alicia, can put their disease experiences into a context where they meet other members that are just like them with similar conditions and find answers to their questions that they may not have been able to ascertain from their PCP or their specialist. And as many of you know in the audience, the average amount of time a person spends with their doctor during a year is 17 minutes. And so patients live with the other 550 or so minutes with themselves and their family. And what we do is not only provide that community, but we also, when patients sign up, we have a policy of openness where patients can share with others as much about their condition as they want so others can learn. And what we do is we collect the data, bringing the lived experience of a patient to the level of evidence. We collect it in a very systematic fashion where it's quantified, and at the same time providing this environment for peer support and learning. And we help patients integrate their symptoms, treatment outcomes, also now their EMR claims, labs, sensor data, all in one place so patients can better manage their health and easily share this back with their healthcare team through something called what we call a doctor visit guide, where all of this data is compiled for a patient. And then when they come see the provider, the specialist, they can share what their lived experience has been. And what this enables patients to do is to improve self-care, also helps keep people from having to go to the emergency department. Because I would see people who, if they just had someone they could ask a question for or to have some kind of help, they would not have to be coming in for a visit. And also to make better and informed healthcare choices. Improving their treatment adherence. So, and with this platform, we work with life sciences organizations, like many of you in the audience, to help understand patients' needs, similar to Alicia, and to help them get to better outcomes faster by incorporating patient perspectives into health economics outcomes research. Also, patients help us optimize with our life sciences partners, clinical trial designs, also providing match controls to reduce trial sizes. And of course, with the pandemic, the whole virtual trial space has really exploded. And when we're talking about health equity, Patients Like Me has that opportunity to really go to where patients are and where they live and create this digital home so that more patients have the opportunity to actually, like Alicia, to participate in research. And Alicia's not only on our team of advisors at Patients Like Me, but she's also on the team of advisors at the NIH in their All of Us program. And recently we had a 3-webinar series all about the importance of health equity and diversity in precision medicine. And Alicia was gracious enough to participate with 3 other patients to talk about why they became involved in research and why this was important to them. So really do thank you for the opportunity to talk about one of the solutions that's out there, which is to always keep patients first and to invite them into every part of the conversation when we're thinking about health equity and certainly precision medicine.
Thank you so much for that overview, Kate. That was really quite helpful. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Elisabeth Heath and ask you a couple of questions. So you are a genitourinary oncologist, and you do a lot of work with cancer clinical trials. And just wanted to ask you, first question is, what is your opinion on personalized versus precision medicine? Many people use those terms interchangeably. Is there a difference, and how would you define precision medicine? particularly as it with respect to oncology?
Yeah, great question. And I also want to thank the organizers, for having this conversation. We won't improve our status unless we have conversations, and one that includes not just the patients, but everybody who has an impact on the table. Because without all of us talking about it, we're all going to remain siloed. Secondly, I just want to applaud Alicia's courage for just sharing this story. It feels like it probably happened yesterday to you. I feel it in listening to your experience. And I think as a cancer physician, these are the kinds of insight and glimpses that I have the privilege of entering every day when I see patients. I have the, I think, ability to kind of look at it both ways, from a researcher as well as a physician, and kind of being on both sides of the arena. And in that sense, I tend not to dwell too much about definitions, whether it's precision or personalized. What I care about is that people know to ask questions. Part of our struggle, I think, with all of this information boom, which is just terrific science and, social media taking off and giving little 150 character snippets of what just happened, and you'd almost think we're getting closer to the cure. It's just so much information that what usually happens is two things. The first is this whole, I want to know everything, and here's an entire stack of things I've Googled, and what are you going to do to tell me whether it's personalized precision, or really, what does it mean for me as an individual? And then I have the other half, which is like, I have no idea. This information is so overwhelming that when you're talking to me, I understand you're trying, but I really have no idea what you're saying. And it will take an interpreter of sorts, like organizations like PatientsLikeMe, or other advocacy groups and support groups locally and or nationally, to say, let's just break this down, because your doctor didn't have 3 hours, but we do. So understanding the terminology really only benefits, I think, the patient or the provider if it somehow means something. Now, for me, every patient, whether it's cancer, lupus, heart disease, gets a personalized medicine approach. You don't treat hypertension the same way in two people. You don't treat rashes or anything from something mild like, a rash to something as severe as cancer. So I think it's really just this understanding that you should pay attention to your treatment as an individual, because science has exploded to a level that it's an organizational sort of, nightmare to get yourself situated. And there's no good way to do it other than talking to a bunch of folks that perhaps have gone through it. But in general, it's staying connected to really what is the question at hand. So I do use the term pretty interchangeably, whether that's right or wrong. But I think people in cancer, though, kind of make that equivalent to, wow, you're going to look at my genes or my DNA or something like that. So there's sort of a sense that it's more than just, what are you doing for me medication wise, but what about my actual genetic information? So there's probably a little bit of that nuance.
That makes a lot of sense. So I personally think about precision medicine in terms of the interplay between your genetics, your personal lifestyle factors, as well as your environment. So it's a trifecta of those three different factors. So areas, but in terms of patient participation from diverse groups, as well as diverse ethnicities. So how do you think the best way, how do you think that we can address this?
And I want to make sure I understand your question, Kemi. I think you cut out just a little bit. It's the topic that you're asking is really clinical trials and sort of diverse representation, and how are we going to do better? Would that be correct?
Yes, that's correct. Because you think about precision medicine and targeted therapy in oncology, for example, and a lot of the information we have is from databases that are not representative of the whole population. So, we all know that it's important to get better representation, but we don't have that right now. Yeah. We have an issue where minorities are not being represented appropriately in many clinical trials. So my question is, what can we do about that? What are some approaches that have helped?
Yeah, and I think this is such a humongous problem that, I really applaud organizations like the American Society of Clinical Oncology, where we just had our giant annual meeting, be it virtual, but there was a mandate, from that meeting to really talk about what are we doing to improve diversity and inclusion, not just sort of in the workforce for oncology, but from a patient representation. I practice in Detroit, Michigan, so my everyday practice is filled more probably with African-American patients because of the makeup of the city of Detroit. But let me tell you that that's not a given. There are no rules to say that because I practice in Detroit, Michigan, that they will seek care here. I think it has to be intentional on every level, starting with making sure that the education and the messaging is on point to reflect what's happening in the community that you're practicing in. I think the other part is there is a large level of trust that you're not going to swoop in, get your quote unquote research done, and then leave when you are done with what you need and leave the community hanging. I think there has to be an effort to understand some of the barriers that might be systemic to their experience as a culture of folks. For us, African Americans make up a great part of the city of Detroit, but Dearborn is right on the outskirts of the city of Detroit, and that has the largest Middle Eastern population outside of the Middle East. So if we're not savvy to that group of folks, they also don't get representation. So I think, health equity has in a lot of ways sort of revolved around the topic of race and ethnicity, but we know geography, socioeconomic, there's so many levels. It's really a matter of figuring out, what are the top priorities in the communities that you serve. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is to ensure that we really, again, are intentional about how to improve accrual to clinical trials. Most of it really starts with an awareness issue, almost like need a button. Of course, we have flyers in our clinic, which is, ask me about a clinical trial. It's one of those things that's the last that gets brought up. Everybody's under a time crunch. You may or may not have just given bad news. And it's really hard to weave that into the conversation. But if we don't sort of put that as an expectation and be, again, intentional about doing it, it won't ever happen. It's going to be one more thing that maybe you just will address next time. So it has to be top of mind. But also, the other approach is getting engagement from the community. Part of our NCI or National Cancer Institute, mandate is to have an Office of Diversity and Inclusion that's really integrated itself in our community. So the faculty and the staff all communicate with community cancer action councils. I had the Karmanos advocacy program, so that once a year, for example, we give a free symposium for our community, and it's been running for 11 years. And it's a great tool to really say, look, we're right in your backyard. No need to, worry about what we're doing. We're going to tell you exactly what we're doing, invite you in, and make sure that you understand what's happening. And so they can ask questions as well. Because if they don't really know, then there's that trust issue isn't there. And that's been fraught, I think, for many, many years, too many years, in terms of the worry and the concern that relates to the topic of clinical trials, starting with the worry that you're a guinea pig. So I'll tell you, in my own practice, I lead with that. And they're okay with that because they know that I'm trying to be as truthful as I can with them about the pros and cons. But it is a very complex problem that I'm just grateful that from an infrastructure standpoint, in big societies and also major centers, not just academic centers, but major centers in different cities, are starting to really pay attention to this area.
No, thank you for that response. I absolutely agree. This is a complex issue that won't be resolved overnight, but we're making some gains. You mentioned key issues of being intentional, access, which we'll touch upon in the next few minutes, and then trust. And the element of trust has been discussed pretty widely in terms of past incidents that have really elicited mistrust in Black and Brown communities. And so, Alicia, I wanted to hear from your perspective, how do we address this issue of trust? We know that it can prevent people from learning about clinical trials and participating in clinical trials, but in spite of that, we do have minority populations that are participating. So how do we overcome that barrier of trust?
I think the biggest thing, the biggest thing for me is probably being transparent, having more African Americans become advocates and being the voice of their own community. A lot of times they need to see someone who looks like them that is doing this to know that they can do it as well. And as I mentioned yesterday, just having someone come out and say, hey, I'm participating in these trials and I'm okay. And if I can do it, you can do it too. And just kind of starting that Me Too movement would be great. I also think it's very important for people of color or just people in general to know upfront the answer to certain questions, such as what is my way out of this trial if I decide that it doesn't fit for me or I'm not comfortable with it, knowing that there won't be any consequences or they won't be judged or put in a difficult position regarding their medical care if they decide that it doesn't fit them. And also transparency and privacy protection. How transparent are the results of this trial and how will my privacy and safety be protected, and not being left in the dark and knowing how, where, and when this information is being used is so very vital and important right now more than ever. I think that both Patients Like Me and the All of Us research program have done a great job with transparency and privacy protection in my experiences in research studies with them, which is why I'm a huge advocate for both. And I think that one of the reasons that I got involved with All of Us was because a large, group of people that, participants are underrepresented groups. So I think that they're doing a great job right now as far as healing and closing that gap that exists between healthcare research and African Americans and the mistrust right now.
That makes a lot of sense. Kate, I'm interested in your opinion on how we get more community involvement and how we address this issue of representation, which we know doesn't necessarily start with the trial sites or the staff, but starts in terms of education and disparities and healthcare. So what has been your experience?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. And really that gets to, I believe, the heart of how we can all together continue moving forward to make progress in solving some of these issues. The first step is really the intentionality that has been mentioned. And it's intentionality for each one of us who's participating here today, whether you're a clinician, or Alicia, certainly, she's been very intentional with her work, or you're a scientist, or you have a new startup, you're an educator. All of us are involved in the caring for people and helping each person have a fair and just opportunity to be just as healthy as possible. For that to happen, we all together need to be laser focused and intentional. And it is my belief that we're at a moment in time now where, in light of what's occurred with the pandemic and what's has been occurring with us in terms of just racial justice throughout the United States and the world, that I believe we can all think about the last two lines of Amanda Gorman, our poet laureate's, the last two lines of her poem, The Hill We Climb. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. That in our roles to think about how we can create space to make progress. And we do, as Alicia mentioned, Patients Like Me has had the privilege of working with the All of Us program in this arena, because what I'm always thinking about are what are some good examples. As a physician and scientist, I like to look at what has been done before. What are some good examples that what are the footprints that we can all follow in? Okay, so we can think about the data we know about, which is just straightforward access to healthcare and coverage for that care. I've practiced in Massachusetts for my entire career, where we have the lowest uninsured rate in the United States. But just because someone has coverage for healthcare, it doesn't mean they have access. Because if you're someone who cannot even go to a primary care physician to help you with your diabetes or your hypertension, it's highly unlikely you're somebody that's going to be signing up for a clinical trial. So tied with, coverage and access is to recognize that, what I saw in the emergency department and what impacted people getting care and taking care of themselves were the issues around housing, food insecurity, lack of social services, lack of jobs. Each one of us in our own environments can create a form of sanctuary for the communities that we serve and that we practice with. And always going back to a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible, and to reduce those avoidable, unnecessary, unfair, and unjust obstacles for everyone. And of course, working with people like Alicia and having a patient at the table for the entire continuum of not only receiving care, but also being part of the conversation to potentially become involved in clinical trials. Now, for me, I like prescribing a patient community to patients for when they have a particular medical problem for patients and their caregivers, whether it's Patients Like Me or other advocacy organization, because that's where people can have some questions answered and get other information, because this is all about leveling the playing field about education. And these are the places that people can learn about resources. Also, patients and families can learn about what a clinical trial is and how they can participate. Over on Patients Like Me, we focus on this access to a deep degree, where this is really part of our DNA. We don't want any patient or family to feel like they're alone, because they can come over and sign up, and you can sign up for free, and you can share as little or as much information as you want. And on our platform, having the ability to participate in research projects is available to you. But when we think about the solutions, we can think about Dr. Lori Pierce that Elisabeth alluded to, who is the president of the American Society of Clinical Oncologists this term, who ran the 2021 ASCO meeting, where every patient, every day, everywhere was the theme. So every part of the meeting, every presentation included the conversation around health equity. So we can go to the heroes, to the leaders in various parts of the healthcare system, within specialties, within life sciences organizations. Who is doing this really well? Which companies have figured out how to go into communities and to partner with communities so that the amount of diversity that is really necessary to represent everybody in developing the molecules, so that we know they're working for every single person. So we definitely want this to be a form of education. We want this to be intentional. Another thing is we want to measure how well we're doing, right? In my organization, in all of your organizations. If we don't measure things, we can't change them. The definition of insanity is to just keep doing the same thing over and over again. If we have metrics, we can follow our progress, and we can hold each other accountable to this, right? Also, patient education, provider education. for example, our physician workforce we have come up with gender equity, but we have not made any progress in the past 3 decades in terms of diversity in medical school applications. And I'm on the faculty of the University of Massachusetts Medical School. I mean, when you look at the data, there was just an April paper in the New England Journal of Medicine that was describing this. So we have to think about our workforce. Also, we need health services research to really unpack and understand how some of these fundamental aspects of how my patients are living are impacting their outcomes. It may not be their biology, but it certainly could be how they're living. Because lived experiences and that data describing one's lived experience, that is what has the key to understanding the deep biology of precision medicine. We really need to understand this. And of course, patient advocacy. We need patient advocates like Alicia and them to be involved in the entire spectrum. And then finally, expanded access to trials. We need to go to where our patients are. And now telemedicine is providing a unique avenue because now this has become an acceptable way for us to interact with our patients. So I am hopeful. I am hopeful because I think everybody in this meeting can be more intentional in our own ways.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. Those are a lot of deep insights and a lot to unpack there. We have a couple of really good questions coming in from our audience. The first question is, what effect will greater inclusion of community health centers as clinical trial sites and other decentralized models have in equity in clinical trial participation? So I'll let Alicia comment on that first, and then Elisabeth.
Could you repeat that question for me, please?
Yes. What effect will greater inclusion of community health centers have in equity in clinical trials?
So like, I guess you're asking like more access to like diversity in the community with clinical trial centers, like having more of those, how would that affect? I'm trying to understand the question a little bit more.
Yeah, so when a lot of the time clinical trials are done at major academic centers where, you know, the centers are traditionally in cities or places that, you know, may not be representative of populations, or they may have fewer minority populations who regularly go there for care. And so if you're not involved in that center or you don't hear about it directly, then you have less of a chance to find out about the trial. So community health centers are sort of a different model in terms of a trial site. You know, so what is your opinion on how inclusion of those types of centers can impact equity?
So I guess for me, this is a deep question because I live in a very rural area, so we don't have access to, you know, we don't have access to anything like this. So I think that for my community, it would be very beneficial to have, you know, places where people can go and get access to these type of cares and information. But I think it boils down to, I think as we mentioned earlier with Dr. Heath, where she's at, there's a large population of African Americans. And so there may be access to more centers like that. In my community, not so much. So I think that it would have a very great impact on my community if we were to have access to something like that. But it's hard for me to answer that question because we don't have it. We don't have it here. So I think that it would have a very great impact on my community if we were to have access to it. But I think it would be a great question for Dr. Heath to be in a community where there is a larger population of African Americans and possibly an opportunity to have centers like that and more access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Alicia, you hit the nail on the head there. You know, if you
don't
had
have it,
right? The question is, would that help? Yes. You know, many healthcare systems now have gone into a sort of network model, whether that again is intentional on their end to sort of improve equity. I'm not sure. I think it's like, well, it's the wave of the future and lots of hospitals are banded together. In our own network, the Karmanos Cancer Institute is the named service line for cancer in like 12 other McLaren-based hospitals throughout the state. So that's everywhere, all the way up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, down to Detroit. In that sense, I am a believer of having, the all centers be involved. And if there's outreach areas that are not even part of the McLaren system, it should be all in. This possibility for decentralization of doing trials is a big, I think, step forward. It's something recommended even by the FDA as a potential way to increase diversity and inclusion. They've had many meetings and have presented recently in many formats, also at ASCO, to sort of, well, here's a proposal from the regulatory self. I'll tell you the struggle with that really idealistic approach. Yes, in theory, folks like myself and Kate and Alicia, we all say that sounds great, but to execute is a whole nother ball of wax. The implementation is so difficult because the regulation is still there. So I'll give you an example. These cancer centers that are throughout the state all have really terrific oncologists there. They practice every day, seeing lots of patients. But when they're trying to give something, for example, like an immunotherapy in a local hospital, and it's on a clinical trial, you have to have, 20,000 things on hand or they won't sign off. Well, the whole point of having it there in your backyard is to recognize that the resources aren't exactly the same. But if they give it to the patient when they're not on a trial, why would it matter if you were on a trial? So we made this argument back and forth, not just to one company, but several companies. Regulations. They said, well, you know what, if something happened, we can't back it up. There's this and that. Until those things get addressed, and maybe it's one at a time they get addressed, I don't see how we can have the true path forward, even if everybody is intentional about it. Am I grateful that pharma of all sizes and companies, life science companies, have diversity and inclusion measures and have this, conversation? 100%. Do I worry that in 3 to 5 years that this conversation will cease or diminish greatly? Absolutely. Why? Because we've had issues like this. It's just whatever was the topic at the moment. I hope it can sustain. We've been doing this thing. I've been here 18 years and it started 18 years ago. And it's only gotten better. But, we're one part of one center of one city in one state. It has to be everybody. So as Kate mentioned, everybody on this call has a role to play. But if the idea of a good idea like decentralization and having community health centers participate can't move forward because we have too many regulations, then maybe that's the conversation we should be having.
Yeah, no, it's a complex issue. And the issue of decentralized trials and virtual trials is one that we know is not going to go away, especially now with the pandemic, where a lot of people have had to pivot and really look at digital solutions in the way that, we sort of looked at them as nice to have before, but now we know that they're really essential. I think even in terms of the digital divide between rural areas, people who have smartphones versus those who don't, and those requirements in order to participate in some clinical trials, that in of itself does, that may further deepen, the discrepancy between different groups. Elisabeth, there's a question for you about the dissonance between clinical trials and the eventual use of medications. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just actually having this conversation last night with a colleague because we had new data, for example, that always seems to not be at odds, but we tend to not pay attention to different data sets. So we're very good at clinical trials. We know level 1 evidence. We like to see the curves separate. Everyone gets excited. There's a beautiful presentation and there's a really nice paper in a big impact journal. But then the question is, okay, so you have this information. Are you going to implement it? So you know the right answer on the test. Are you going to put it down? And I think what we're learning, and there were 3 abstracts, for example, looking at, just claims data, Medicare, whatever is the claims insurance data that you're looking at. And what you're seeing, so this is again specific to a group of men who have metastatic disease with prostate cancer, but have still sensitive disease to hormone injections and so on. The reality is the data is not getting translated to how we think it should. So unfortunately, all of that work doesn't seem to have taken, and there's a disparity so that those patients who really are not even getting what is now the standard of care after you went through that whole rigmarole with clinical trials, there's a disparity between, Black and white men with prostate cancer. So it just keeps trickling down if we don't, again, hold ourselves accountable to saying, well, looky here, we've got this really terrific data, lots of, patient thanks and everybody who showed up to make this happen, but we don't really gauge whether we do it. Well, then the ball gets dropped again. So it's a really multifaceted issue of how do we get folks on trial to break those barriers to, okay, we found the answer and now we don't even get, the actual drugs to the right person. It just could be discouraging. My view on this is we know the information, let's do something about it. One of the initiatives, for example, that we've done here in the last 5 years was in collaboration with Johns Hopkins was to kind of look at who else shows up to the party and discussing about clinical trials. So lots of things that Kate, you mentioned about barriers, one of them actually is the physician himself or herself. If you don't make the offer or you have biases you're not aware of, you're not going to sort of do what you're supposed to do. And you're not mean about it. It's just how it is. So one of the studies that was done by Dr. Egley in a R01 funded grant was to look at physician intervention. We all had to do implicit bias training, get reminders that this is the right thing to do. Between our 2 centers and multiple physicians in different disciplines, even the folks like us who kind of, supposedly are supposed to do it right, we got better. We got better at, communicating with patients. We got better at bringing up the trials. We got better at mitigating our own implicit bias. We took the training and it was like an eye opener. So even in expert institutions, you could do better. So there's just a whole level of how we have to almost organize the health system to say, we've done all this. Who's going to hold us accountable? And I don't need more widgets. I agree with you about the outcomes, but I think in this instance, when you're looking at claims data, which is pretty easy, it's either you prescribe the right medicine or you don't. But if you don't, you should get to the bottom of why, don't you?
Yeah, we definitely have to be intentional. I agree with all of your points. That any initiatives that you are aware of to improve the understanding of developing treatments for either rare diseases or cancer? So anyone who wants to respond to this.
I'll take that question. I'm incredibly optimistic here. And one of the reasons is that over at PatientsLikeMe, we actually have many, many, many thousands of patients with rare diseases. And I've done quite a bit of listening and talking to our members who do have rare diseases. And I think everybody on the call understands that SARS-2 or the coronavirus, when this first appeared, this may have been known to infectious disease scientists. And for me, I knew about SARS because I was running my emergency department when SARS appeared a number of years ago. But essentially, coronavirus was like a rare disease, right? So many of my rare disease patients are incredibly hopeful that the amount of intention, focus, scientific rigor, and cooperation that we witnessed simultaneously with scientists all around the world, particularly delving into the deep biology that has led to the understanding of the mechanisms, the development of treatments, also the vaccine development, that for those of us who've been in medicine for a long time are completely blown away by this. This has been nothing short of a miracle to watch because of the intentionality that was put into this work. And in working with a number of our partners, this same level of intentionality is going on now, matching what we call lived experience, real world evidence, and raising that to the level of evidence, in matching this with patients' deep biology, right? Whether we're talking about looking for protective mutations, their DNA, their RNA, looking at their proteins, their immunosignatures, metals and toxins, and developing these massive data sets to really uncover some of the mechanisms that are unknown to solve these vexing problems of understanding why certain patients get these rare conditions, for example, or other diseases. That work has been accelerated because of the pandemic. And I am by nature optimistic. But this, from my point of view, listening to our patients, I think we have a reason to hope. And I'm very hopeful that many of you in the audience today will be the individuals working on teams that will be discovering these new molecules.
From those. We just have a few minutes left, and I'd like to hear from each one of you about what's working in your mind, and just, you know, any last words that you have for our audience today. So I'll start with Alicia.
Right now, I think what's working is everything that Patients Like Me and the All of Us research program is doing as far as transparency, privacy, bringing the patient voice to the forefront, making patients feel more like a partner instead of a study. Anytime that we are in the loop of what's going on, and it's better for everyone all around. So right now, I just really think that what they're doing is amazing. I think that they're shedding light on communities that haven't always had a voice at the table. And I think that's very important. And I think that it's definitely building that bridge of trust that's needed in order to make a change. So that's working, in my opinion. And I think if we keep up and we get more people to speak up, and like I was saying, kind of like that Me Too movement, and just to speak up and about their experiences and how it's working for them right now as far as health research goes today. I think if we continue on this path, I think that there's a great future ahead for all of us. It's working.
Wonderful. Keep patients at the center.
Yeah.
Elisabeth, any last words on what's working in health equity?
First of all, thank you again for just having. I've enjoyed this conversation with everyone, and I look forward to more. I think it does come down to conversation. The fact that we can have this webinar, the fact that many of us are on different task force and committees to tackle this problem gives me so much hope. It's something that I have not seen before, and I hope it continues.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And Kate, go ahead.
Yeah, and so I think actually my finishing comments would actually be answering one of the questions I think that we didn't quite hit, which was how can we improve healthcare access in lower income clinics? I think that really what has come out of this moment in time in the conversation about health equity and precision medicine is the recognition and understanding that basically every person deserves to be healthy, and that each one of us in our own work, in our own effort every single day has that opportunity. And by understanding that people need to have access to care, and we figure out how to provide coverage for that care so that patients can be as healthy as possible. And of course, then they can participate in clinical trials. And then we, of course, can understand that we have the right treatments for everybody and not just a small segment of people who were eligible or who participated in clinical trials. So I think this intentionality, this focus, this conversation, us all being here together is really very positive. And thank you for the invitation.
Wonderful. No, I couldn't agree more. And hopefully we'll continue the conversation. And thank you. I just wanted to thank everybody for attending today's panel discussion. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And yes, thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kemi, and thank you to our panelists, Alicia, Kate, and Elisabeth, for a really engaging conversation on health equity in the context of life sciences. We value your contribution and thank you for being available this afternoon.